This video is sponsored by Wings of Heroes. Jackboots echoes through the stairway of a Warsaw apartment building. Witold Pilecki, co-founder of the secret Polish army, can hear his sister-in-law's panic breathing from across the room, the muffled cries of neighbors being dragged into the street below. Pilecki peers out of the window at the trucks filling up with prisoners bound for a new Nazi camp near the southern Polish town of Oświęcim. He thinks of his wife and two small children. But he doesn't run. He doesn't hide. As the yelling German voices grow ever nearer, he simply studies his fake ID documents, making sure he has every detail memorized. And when the Schutzpolizei finally come bursting through the door, he calmly raises his hands in surrender. Just as planned, he's on his way to Auschwitz, and his mission is about to begin. World War II was defined by acts of extraordinary courage, from the resistance movements like Witold Pilecki's to the deadly dogfights in the skies overhead. If you want to experience the aerial side of the conflict in stunning detail, we at Dark Docs highly recommend Wings of Heroes. Wings of Heroes is a free-to-play mobile game that puts you in the cockpit of the war's most legendary aircraft. Believe us, this isn't just some arcade button masher. This is realistic combat with authentic World War II planes, each with unique handling and capabilities. You can jump right in with intuitive controls, but discover serious depth with upgrades, customization, and tactical gameplay. One of our favorite things about Wings of Heroes is the 5 vs 5 PvP combat. With it, you're not flying solo. You're coordinating with your squadron in intense battles where teamwork and strategy decide who owns the skies. Like us, upgrade your engines, armor, and weapons to build your perfect fighter, then take on real opponents in historically inspired clashes. Another thing we at Dark Docs really love is the Ace mode, the ultimate challenge, where auto-aim is disabled and only true skill wins the day. The game keeps getting better too, with new planes, maps, and missions added every month. Download Wings of Heroes for free using our link in the description or by scanning the QR code on screen. What's more, you can use our code DARKDOCS to get an exclusive starter aircraft skin absolutely free. Join us in the skies with Wings of Heroes. Resistance was in Witold Pilecki's blood. Born in 1901 to a Polish family exiled to remote Russian Karelia for taking part in an uprising against Tsarist rule, he had a strong sense of nationalist pride instilled in him from a young age. In 1910, Pilecki's mother moved him and his siblings to the multi-ethnic city of Vilnius so they could attend Polish schools. There, at just 12 years old, Witold joined the underground Polish Scouting Association, an illegal organization in the Russian Empire. Indeed, this was no innocent group of boys building campfires and earning merit badges. It was part of an underground nationalist movement. By 1916, in the midst of World War I, Pilecki had founded his own chapter in Oriel, Russia, aimed at preparing personnel for the future Polish army. At 17, he led a daring raid on a Russian military barracks, stealing weapons and uniforms for the coming fight. The Russian guard had opened fire, but nobody was hurt. Soon afterwards, with the war coming to a close, Pilecki returned to Vilnius, where he and his fellow scouts joined the city's self-defense units to help see off the remaining German occupiers. On New Year's Eve 1918, as the last German soldiers departed, Pilecki commanded the guard at the Gate of Dawn, standing watch over the famous image of the Virgin Mary. It seemed Vilnius would form part of a newly independent Poland after 123 years of foreign rule. But a new threat was growing on the eastern horizon, the new Bolshevik regime and its Red Army. Just 5 days after the Germans left, the Bolsheviks arrived. Pilecki and the defenders were forced to retreat, but he refused to give up the fight. He joined the legendary Dąbrowski brothers cavalry unit, learning guerrilla warfare in the forests and marshes of the Polish eastern borderlands. For the next 2 years, Pilecki fought in the Polish-Soviet War, a conflict that would determine whether Poland would survive its rebirth. He participated in the Kiev offensive, defended the city of Grodno, and fought in the decisive Battle of Warsaw in August 1920, where Polish forces stopped the Soviet advance that threatened to sweep across Europe. The war ended in March 1921 with Poland's victory, but the cost had been enormous. Pilecki, promoted to corporal at just 19 years old, had been transformed from a rebellious scout into a hardened soldier. He had learned how to survive impossible odds, how to fight outnumbered, and how to lead men in desperate circumstances. These lessons would prove invaluable, but first, Pilecki had other plans. With the war over, Pilecki finally had the chance for a normal life. After completing his education, he took over the family estate at Sokurcha, a small property near Lida, the only land the Pileckis had managed to retain ownership of after their exile. However, after years of neglect, the estate was in ruins. For the next 13 years, Pilecki threw himself into farming, slowly bringing Sokurcha back to life. In 1931, he got married, and before long, he and his wife had 2 children. Yet Pilecki never stopped being a soldier. As a reserve cavalry officer, he continued regular military training and exercises. More importantly, he organized the Krakus units, a mounted cadet corps that trained local young men in horsemanship and military skills under the guise of community service. It was the same pattern he had learned as a scout in Vilnius: prepare in peacetime for the war you know is coming. By the summer of 1939, everyone in Poland knew it was coming. Nazi Germany had remilitarized the Rhineland, annexed Austria, and dismembered Czechoslovakia. Hitler's demands on Poland grew louder and more aggressive. The question wasn't if war would start, but when. On August 26th, Pilecki kissed his wife and children goodbye and reported for mobilization. He was assigned as a cavalry platoon commander in the 19th Infantry Division. The men under his command were mostly local farmers, men he had trained in the Krakus units. They knew him, trusted him, and would follow him into the storm. At 4:45 a.m. on September 1st, German forces crossed the Polish border. World War II had begun. Pilecki's 19th Infantry Division fought desperately against the German blitzkrieg, but they were hopelessly outmatched. Modern German armor and aircraft smashed through Polish defensive lines designed for a different kind of war. On the night of September 5th, at the Battle of Piotrków-Trybunalski, the division was virtually annihilated. The survivors, including Pilecki, were absorbed into the hastily formed 41st Infantry. Pilecki served as second in command of the cavalry detachment under Major Jan Włodarkiewicz. Despite being surrounded and outnumbered, Pilecki's unit fought with desperate courage, destroying 7 German tanks, shooting down 1 aircraft, and destroying 2 more on the ground. But individual acts of bravery couldn't change the outcome. On September 17th, any hope of Polish victory died. The Soviet Union invaded from the east, implementing the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Poland was being carved up between 2 totalitarian powers. Włodarkiewicz and Pilecki made a different choice. They would not flee their homeland. Instead, they shed their uniforms, assumed false identities, and made their way to Warsaw, now under German occupation. On November 9, 1939, in the apartment of Eleonora Ostrowska, Pilecki and Włodarkiewicz founded the Secret Polish Army, or TAP in Polish. It was one of the first resistance organizations in occupied Poland. Pilecki became the organization's chief of staff, responsible for recruitment and building the network. Within months, TAP had spread across central Poland: Warsaw, Siedlce, Radom, Lublin, with nearly 20,000 members, mostly young people being trained by reserve officers like Pilecki. They gathered intelligence, smuggled weapons, and prepared for the day they could strike back at their occupiers. But the Germans were determined to crush any hint of Polish resistance, and they were building something new to do it: a concentration camp at a small town called Oświęcim. The Germans called it Auschwitz. By the summer of 1940, disturbing reports were reaching Warsaw. Prisoners were passing away at an alarming rate, but nobody knew why or what was really happening inside the new camp. Major Włodarkiewicz called a meeting of TAP's leadership. Looking directly at Pilecki, he announced that someone needed to infiltrate Auschwitz, gather intelligence, and organize resistance from within. It wasn't exactly an order. Włodarkiewicz carefully called it an invitation to volunteer. But Pilecki understood what it really was. Recent tensions had fractured the relationship. Włodarkiewicz had grown increasingly radical, pushing an ultranationalist agenda that Pilecki found distasteful. When Pilecki had gone behind his back to negotiate TAP's merger with the larger Home Army Resistance Network under Colonel Stefan Rowecki, Włodarkiewicz had been furious. This volunteer mission was punishment as much as it was duty, but Pilecki accepted anyway. Now he had to get himself in. the Germans conducted regular street roundups in Warsaw, snatching civilians at random to fill their camps and labor battalions. Pilecki would deliberately place himself in one of these roundups, carrying false ID documents in the name of Tomasz Serafinski, a Polish reserve officer whose papers had fallen into TAP's hands. On September 19, 1940, Pilecki walked into his sister-in-law's apartment in the Zolibors district, knowing the Germans were conducting a roundup on that very street. When they burst into the room, Pilecki made no attempt to hide. 2 days later, crammed into a cattle car with over 1,700 other men, he arrived at Auschwitz. He knew the odds of survival were minimal, and would likely never see his wife or 2 small children again. He wrote that he, quote, bade farewell to everything I'd hitherto known on this earth, and entered something seemingly no longer of it. The mission had begun. Pilecki was given a striped uniform, had his head and body shaved, and was assigned prisoner number 4859. However, when he carried the number in his hand rather than in his mouth as instructed, one of the prison guards smacked him in the jaw with a heavy rod, knocking out 2 of his teeth. It was the first taste of the brutal treatment he would soon become accustomed to. At first, Pilecki was given what seemed to be a stroke of luck, appointed room leader in Block 17, responsible for maintaining order and cleanliness. But he would answer to block leader Alois Staller, a German communist known as Bloody Alois, who demanded that his functionaries beat and abuse other prisoners to maintain discipline. Pilecki refused. He was immediately stripped of his position and sent to the hardest outdoor labor commandos. As winter approached, the prisoners had no coats, no socks, only wooden clogs. They worked from dawn until dark, hauling stones, digging ditches, building the infrastructure of their own prison. Men perished every day. Some were beaten lifeless for working too slowly or shot for some imagined infraction. Others were crushed by falling construction materials or succumbed to exhaustion, hunger, or the cold. In October, within weeks of his arrival, Pilecki was able to smuggle out his first report. Young officer Alexander Wielopolski, about to be released, memorized Pilecki's observations and delivered them to TAP headquarters in Warsaw. The report detailed the systematic brutality, the starvation, the murders, early evidence of Nazi war crimes that would reach London by March 1941. Yet by that time, Pilecki had almost become the next victim himself. That winter, he'd contracted pneumonia, yet had been forced to continue working in the cold despite the inadequacy of his clothing. His weakened body was unlikely to hold out for long. However, fortune intervened. Dr. Vladislav Dering, a fellow TAP member, had secured a position in the camp hospital. Dering rushed to help Pilecki, hiding him in the hospital and nursing him back to health. It was a turning point. Pilecki realized that survival required more than individual endurance. It required organization. Using TAP members as his foundation, he began building what he called the Union of Military Organizations, or ZOW in Polish, a resistance network within Auschwitz itself. The structure was careful and clever. Basic units consisted of 5 prisoners who knew only each other. These 5s were organized by blocks and work commandos, with each layer of leadership isolated from the others. If the Gestapo captured one member, they could only expose a handful of names, not the entire network. Pilecki recruited men he had known from the cavalry, scouts, and the Polish-Soviet War. Slowly, carefully, ZOW began to spread through Auschwitz, as members secured critical positions in crucial areas of the camp. Dr. Dering and others in the hospital could save lives by admitting prisoners before they collapsed, hiding them during selections, and even eliminating SS informants through carefully administered overdoses. In the Arbeitsdienst employment office, ZOW members could assign prisoners to better work commandos, extending their chances of survival by months or years. Meanwhile, intelligence continued flowing to Warsaw through released prisoners and successful escapees. In 1942, ZOW achieved something extraordinary. They built a radio transmitter from smuggled parts over 7 months. Hidden within the camp, they broadcast regular updates on arrivals, fatalities, and conditions. And over the course of that year, they noticed concerning changes. The Germans had constructed a second facility less than 2 miles away at Birkenau, known as Auschwitz II. From March, daily trains began arriving, not carrying the ethnic Polish political prisoners that made up the majority of the inmates at Pilecki's camp, but packed with thousands of Jewish men, women, and children from across occupied Europe. Most worryingly, these new arrivals were disappearing at an alarming rate. Some would vanish immediately, others would be put to work for a few weeks or months, and then one day never be seen again. Soon, Pilecki and his ZOW comrades began putting the pieces together. The towering columns of black smoke they could see from their own camp, the horrible stench that persisted day and night, and whispers of shower rooms from which nobody returned. They came to a clear conclusion. The Germans were using lethal gas to carry out extermination on an unprecedented scale. Pilecki's radio broadcasts became increasingly desperate. He begged for the Polish Home Army to attempt an assault on the camp, but was met with silence. He even tried to convince London and Washington to intervene, pleading for bombing raids, even if it meant his own destruction. But no bombers came. By autumn 1942, Pilecki was growing increasingly frustrated. Then security concerns forced him to dismantle the radio transmitter. The Gestapo was starting to close in on ZOW. The interrogations grew more violent, the executions more frequent. The organization he'd assembled was gradually crumbling as the men he had recruited disappeared one by one. Pilecki realized that if he stayed, he would undoubtedly meet the same fate. But if he could escape and deliver his testimony in person, face to face with the Home Army leadership, perhaps he could make them understand what he had witnessed. Perhaps he could convince them that an uprising was still possible. On the night of April 26, 1943, Pilecki put his plan into motion. He'd managed to get himself and 2 other ZOW members assigned to the night shift at the camp bakery, located outside the main fence. Around midnight, they forced open a metal door they had been studying for weeks, overpowered a guard, and cut the telephone line. Before fleeing, they barricaded the unconscious guards in a woodshed and severed the alarm wire. Then they ran east into the darkness. German soldiers spotted them and opened fire. Bullets tore through Pilecki's clothing. One round struck him, but miraculously missed both bones and vital organs. The 3 men kept running, eventually reaching the cover of nearby forests. For days, they moved mostly at night, aided by Polish civilians who risked their lives to shelter them. A priest in the village of Alvernia provided food and directions. Locals in Tyniec helped them onward. Finally, they reached a resistance safe house near Bochnia. The owner of the house introduced himself. His name was Tomasz Serafiński, the very man whose ID documents Pilecki had been using for 2.5 years. The 2 men stared at each other for a moment, then burst out laughing at the absurd coincidence. After several days of recovery, Pilecki made contact with the local Home Army command. In June 1943, he drafted his first post-escape report in Nowy Wiesnich, detailing everything he had witnessed. He buried it at the farm where he was staying. It wouldn't be discovered until after the war. By August, Pilecki was back in Warsaw, ready to convince the Home Army leadership to liberate Auschwitz. The Home Army commanders listened to Pilecki's testimony with grim faces. They studied his detailed maps of Auschwitz, reviewed his intelligence on guard positions and weaknesses. But their verdict was the same as it had been when they'd read his earlier reports. An assault on the camp was impossible. Their reasoning was coldly logical. Even if they could breach the defenses, which was doubtful, they had no way to evacuate thousands of emaciated prisoners. No trucks, no supplies, no safe houses to shelter them. The Soviet Red Army, now within striking distance of Auschwitz, showed zero interest in a joint operation. Any attack would almost certainly end in a massacre. Pilecki had risked everything, sacrificed 2.5 years of his life, watched countless friends pass away in horrific circumstances, all in the hope of liberating Auschwitz. Now he was being told it had been for nothing. But he wasn't ready to give up just yet. Using the alias Roman Jezierski, he joined the Khedive sabotage unit and continued coordinating with ZOW members still trapped inside Auschwitz, providing what limited support he could. He also joined NIE, a secret anti-communist organization, preparing for what many resistance fighters feared would come next: Soviet occupation replacing Nazi occupation. In February 1944, he received word of his promotion to cavalry captain, with seniority backdated to November 1943. It was recognition of his Auschwitz mission, though the honor felt hollow, knowing the prisoners he'd left behind were still losing their lives by the thousands. By the time summer came, the strategic situation had transformed. The Soviets were advancing from the east, pushing the Germans back toward Poland. Warsaw's resistance leaders saw an opportunity. If they could liberate the capital before the Red Army arrived, they might establish Polish sovereignty and prevent Soviet domination. Nevertheless, they quickly realized that despite their political differences, they would most likely need Soviet help if they were to successfully free Warsaw. As the Red Army reached the outskirts of the city, the Polish resistance made its move. On August 1st, 1944, the Warsaw Uprising began. Pilecki's superiors in NIE had explicitly forbidden him from participating. If the Soviets did take over, he would be highly valuable for intelligence work. But Pilecki had never been good at following orders he disagreed with. After all, he had refused to leave Poland in 1939. Now, as gunfire erupted across Warsaw, he wasn't prepared to just sit back and watch from the sidelines. Without thinking twice, he joined the Warsaw Company as a common soldier, concealing his rank and identity. The uprising was only expected to last a few days. With the combined efforts of the Polish and the Soviets, the Germans were unlikely to hold out for long. There was just one problem. The Red Army hadn't arrived. They had halted their advance on the eastern bank of the Vistula, leaving Warsaw to fight alone. Stalin had no interest in supporting a Polish resistance loyal to the London government in exile. Better to let the Germans destroy them than occupy a weakened Poland without opposition. Now, enraged by the Poles' defiance, the Germans responded with overwhelming force. They systematically leveled entire neighborhoods, executed civilians en masse, and deployed heavy artillery and armor against lightly armed resistance fighters. As officers fell in the street fighting, Pilecki revealed his true identity and rank. He took command of the 1st Warsaw Company, deployed in the city's Śródmieście district. His most critical assignment was holding the intersection at Jerusalem Abbey and Starinkiewicz Square, a vital crossroads that would later be called Witold's stronghold. The Germans threw everything at his position: artillery shells, panzer assaults, infantry attacks, but Pilecki and his men held. Day after day, week after week, they defended that intersection as the city crumbled around them. By early October, ammunition was exhausted. Food was gone. Warsaw's population had been decimated. Over 200,000 residents had lost their lives, most of them civilians. The city itself was reduced to rubble. Hitler had ordered its complete destruction as punishment for the uprising. On October 2nd, the uprising's leaders accepted the inevitable and ordered surrender. Pilecki, knowing the Germans' reputation for executing resistance fighters, hid his weapons before coming forward. He was sent to Oflag 7A, a prisoner of war camp for Polish officers near Murnau in Bavaria. There, he would spend the next 6 months as the war ground to its conclusion. On April 29, 1945, American forces liberated Oflag 7A. Pilecki was free again, but Poland was not. The country was now under Soviet occupation, with a communist puppet government installed in Warsaw. For men like Pilecki, who had fought for Polish independence, the victory over Nazi Germany felt hollow. One tyranny had simply been replaced by another. After making his way to Italy, where he joined the Polish Second Corps under General Władysław Anders, Pilecki was soon given a dangerous new mission: return to Poland and report back on the military and political situation under Soviet control. The risks were perhaps even greater than they had been in Auschwitz. At least in the concentration camp, the enemy had been clear. Now he would be operating in a country where Polish communists hunted their own countrymen. Before leaving, Pilecki compiled his Auschwitz reports into a comprehensive account. He suspected he might not survive this latest assignment, and he wanted the full story preserved. By December 1945, he was back in Warsaw, living under assumed names and recruiting a new intelligence network from former TAP and ZOW members. He had several different jobs, constantly moving, constantly changing identities. The information he gathered, communist crimes, Soviet economic exploitation, rigged trials, flowed back to Anders in Italy. In July 1946, Pilecki received devastating news. The communist secret police had uncovered his identity. Anders immediately ordered him to leave Poland, but Pilecki refused. His wife and children were there and did not want to emigrate. Besides, there was no suitable replacement to continue his vital intelligence work. The order was eventually rescinded in early 1947. Pilecki stayed, knowing the danger was growing with each passing day. On May 8th, the secret police came for him. The interrogations were brutal. For months, the communist secret police tortured Pilecki, trying to break him and expose his network. But the man who had survived Auschwitz refused to betray his comrades. He protected other operatives by revealing nothing of value. His show trial began on March 3, 1948. The charges were predetermined, the verdict already decided. He was accused of espionage for foreign imperialism, plotting to assassinate government officials, illegal border crossings, and carrying weapons. Pilecki denied the assassination charges and rejected the accusation of espionage. He had only sent information to the Polish Second Corps. How could that be treason if he was an officer? He pled guilty to the other charges, knowing it wouldn't matter. One witness at the trial was particularly damning. Józef Sienkiewicz, Poland's prime minister, himself an Auschwitz survivor. But where other former prisoners pleaded for Pilecki's life, Sienkiewicz instead insisted he must be treated harshly as, quote, an enemy of the state. On May 15, 1948, Pilecki was sentenced. 10 days later, on May 25th, executioner Piotr Śmietański shot him in the back of the head at Mokotów prison, the same Katyn method the Soviets had used to dispatch thousands of Polish officers. His body was dumped in an unmarked grave, location unknown, while his family was forced to live as outcasts, the relatives of a quote-unquote traitor. It was only after the fall of the Eastern Bloc in 1990, over 4 decades later, that they even learned he'd been executed. Pilecki was finally honored as a hero in Poland. He was rehabilitated, awarded the Order of the White Eagle, and posthumously promoted to colonel. Streets and institutions bear his name, and his story is taught in schools, while the Pilecki Institute researches those who aided Polish victims of totalitarianism. Poland's chief rabbi, Michael Schudrick, wrote in the foreword of a 2012 translation of Pilecki's report, quote, "When God created the human being, God had in mind that we should all be like Captain Witold Pilecki." A firm salute to Wings of Heroes for sponsoring today's video. Remember, you can download the game for free today by using the link in the description or scanning the QR code. And don't forget to get your exclusive starter aircraft skin by redeeming our code, DARKDOCS.